I want to welcome our next speaker, who is Jonathan Corrado, he is with the Korea Society. Jonathan will be addressing us how the Hungnam evacuation can potentially bring about peace with North Korea. So, John.
Thank you, Father Sinclair. Thank you, everybody. Is this good? I knew I risked slipping attention spans by putting a word like Rapprochement on the PowerPoint title. So here we go. What I wanted to ask is whether this Hungnam evacuation story, which is so inspirational for South Korean audiences and American audiences, and indeed audiences around the world, whether it could have the same kind of effect in public diplomacy initiatives with North Korea. And I'll cut right to the chase. My argument is going to be that this story can be uniquely powerful in reaching the hearts and the minds of the North Korean people. And I'll explain throughout this presentation why I think that's the case. Of course, when I'm talking about a public diplomacy campaign to North Korea, I'm not talking about working collaboratively with the North Korean government to disseminate the story, because the North Korean government has its own very conflicting version of what events exactly transpired during the Korean War, and indeed, in particular, during the Hungnam evacuation. This story is uniquely powerful because it simultaneously undercuts all of the lies that the Kim regime, Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and his grandson, Kim Jong-un, continue to perpetrate about what transpired during the war, and also simultaneously, in a parallel track, builds goodwill for North Koreans and the American people. When we do interviews of North Korean people, ordinary people who come as refugees to the South, and Seoul National University has been doing interviews with them every year for multiple decades. So it's a great data set that we could look at to see, how do ordinary North Korean people think and feel about the world? And when we ask them which countries they feel threatened by, they feel threatened by the United States. These are normal people. And over time, the rate at which those North Korean respondents have indicated that the United States is the most threatening country, that rate has climbed and climbed over the years. So can we do something about that? And how can this story help to play a role? So here's my main argument, the things that I've just identified. So let's start with North Korea's depiction of the war. I think Josh gave us a really great structure for thinking about how history and memory interact with one another, and North Korea is no different. In fact, it has an even more complicated relationship between the official government version of the history and what normal, ordinary people are understanding. And that's because since the 1990s, when there was a massive famine in North Korea and they were forced to open up the border to black market trade, all sorts of new ideas in the form of foreign media and culture started to illicitly spread throughout the country. And for the first time, folks got an understanding about how other countries portray the Korean War. And that doesn't just include the way that the U.S. might make it in movies and the way South Korea might make it in movies. Even the way that Chinese movies portray the war undercut and undermine the way that the North Korean government projects things. So we'll get a chance to look through that. So when we talk about the differences in how the war is presented, we can start with the name itself, right? North Korea calls it the Fatherland Liberation War. In South Korea, it's called Yukio, literally just 625, the date of North Korea's invasion, right? So South Korea is clearly pointing to, you started the war, right? In America, the Korean War. In China, the war to resist American imperialism and aid our socialist brothers, right? So we can't even agree on what the war should be called. So under North Korea's version of the narrative, it was South Korea that started the war with the support of the U.S., and it was the U.S. goal to perpetuate an imperialist agenda over all of Asia. And it was Kim Il-sung who did his brilliant tactics and his last stand to defend North Korea. And it was thanks to his heroics that North Korea remains free of U.S. imperialism today. This is not a history that is in history books and forgotten. Every year, from the anniversary of the start of the war to the anniversary of the end of the war, they hold rallies. They talk about it in schools. It's through media, radio, television, movies, literature. It is pounded over the head of every single North Korean, these lies about what happened in the war. And so in this very unique informational ecosystem, there persist these myths about what exactly happened. And of course, one of the big mainstays of the North Korean portrayal of the war is the U.S. soldiers committing atrocities. That's something that North Koreans just become so desensitized to. Americans as barbarians, Americans killing innocent women and children, and just through repeated exposure over and over and over again, it's difficult to not accept that portrayal. So North Koreans just grow up with this being the norm. How do they depict the Hungnam evacuation? Well, this is a tricky case, right? Because why would the North Koreans talk about this? This is an embarrassment. Thousands of their own people chose to leave their country, right? So that undermines North Korea's depiction of the war as we are the defenders, we are the saviors, and it puts them in a bad light, right? But North Koreans, to a certain extent, the Agitation and Propaganda Department really can't help themselves. If there's ever a chance to kind of stick a finger in the eye of South Korea, they love to do it. And so there were two separate instances I found in North Korean media recently where the Hungnam evacuation was mentioned. They were both in 2017, and as we all know, this was a high-profile moment because of President Moon Jae-in's own personal affiliation with the Hungnam evacuation. And so we got an opportunity to see how North Korea talks about what happened during the Hungnam evacuation. So here's what they say. Here's their version of the history. And it's a quite alternate history, right? This is just completely fabricated. So first of all, people only boarded the ships because A, they were lied to by U.S. propaganda, or B, they were afraid of U.S. atomic weapons. Those were the only reasons that they got onto the ship. And then thereafter, these North Koreans suffered from being separated from their families. Well, yes, that's true, but why is that the case, right? It's the policies of the North Korean government. That doesn't get mentioned. The Battle of the Chosin Reservoir, the bitterest defeat the U.S. has suffered in its hundreds of years long history of war. Another mainstay of North Korean propaganda, loving this David and Goliath depiction of the Korean War, love to reiterate that over and over. And then you could see point number 5 is really the reason that I think they were unable to resist temptation and just had to talk, because they could have just, in 2017, President Moon Jae-in visited a museum and he talked about and celebrated the legacy of the Hungnam evacuation. And then the South Korean government was also considering purchasing one of these ships, a Victory ship, to make a museum out of in 2017. North Korea could have just said nothing, right? They could have just said nothing. But instead they talked about it, and why, and I think that's point number 5. So in these articles, they say that South Korea is blind with U.S. worshiping and obsessed with pro-U.S. subservience, right? So it's continuing to pound that same nail over and over again, that North Korea is the sole legitimate representation of the Korean people and South Korea is a puppet of the United States. So why does North Korea present the war this way? It's about their legitimacy, right? If they acted defensively, which we know they didn't, we have the archival records that were given by the Russian government after the fall of the Soviet Union. The Russian government wanted money from the South Korean government, so they opened up their archives and gave us all these really amazing treasures. And in that, we have records of the planning of the war, in which the Soviets give the idea to the North Koreans, say, hey, let's present this as a ruse, as a response to a South Korean aggression, thereby masking the invasion. So that was a Soviet idea that the North Koreans carried out faithfully, and we have the records of it. It's impossible to lie or ignore about if you're willing to accept what comes out of the Russian archives. But of course, the North Koreans do not, and even the Chinese do not. This event, the Korean War, becomes the cornerstone of the Kim family myth building. Again, just building up the bona fides of the leader. And then perhaps these last two are the most important in terms of a contemporary context, because the presence of the evil United States, which came to invade us once and could do it again at any moment, is the perfect justification for a totalitarian government to have complete control over its population, and also to keep the country on a war footing, right? The rally around the flag effect. So it's very useful. The North Koreans use this history on a daily basis. Do North Koreans believe all this, right? It's a bunch of hooey. We all know that. But for them, it's complicated. It's tough, because this is the primary narrative that they are presented with day in, day out. And so the answer to the question is, it's a little bit complicated. So you see that graph there, that's from the Seoul National University survey that I mentioned earlier. It's about half the people, even more, who think that state media is basically factual, somewhat factual or mostly factual. But then when you ask them, how do you like to learn about the outside world? About half of them say, I learn it from my trusted sources, friends, neighbors, family members. Only a very small amount, 10% said state newspapers, and 7% said radio, and 20% said foreign media, right? So there's this sense that I can't exactly trust what I'm getting from the government, but I don't really have reliable alternative sources. One of the really important things to understand is, you look at this and you say, well, why can't they just have an epiphany and realize what they're being told is all a bunch of lies and they're being brainwashed? What they're lacking is a frame of reference, and that's something that they realize once they get out. And so I have a bunch of quotes here. One defector saying, it was only upon arriving in South Korea that we realized how unhappy we really were. They get used to being deprived of freedoms. They get used to this particular information environment, and they're so accustomed to it, even if they know that their country isn't exactly flourishing, they don't know how prosperous other countries are. It wouldn't be atypical for the average North Korean to very rarely take public transportation, to they are forced to work at state jobs in which they make wages enough to buy 2 or 3 kilograms of rice per month, right? But they're conditioned to think that this is the norm, because everyone around them that they could see is also dealing with the same situation. And that's why foreign culture, particularly South Korean movies, music, television shows, is so powerful, because it shows them an alternative, not just people living rich lives, right? Because that could just be glitzy propaganda, just like their government makes glitzy propaganda about the virtues of their socialist utopia. Why wouldn't the South be doing the same thing, right? But just people making choices freely about their love lives, about their occupations, about where to live, about what to do, that is totally befuddling and new to them. So what happens after North Koreans watch South Korean media? Well, it has a pretty profound effect. As you can see here, 75% said that their perception of South Korea improved a lot, and 80% said that their curiosity towards the South went up. And they even start imitating South Korean speech patterns, even to the extent that there was a recent law passed in North Korea that specifically forbade the usage of certain words, such as the word oppa. Oppa just means older brother, but South Koreans mean it to describe an older male friend, a woman speaker would say it, or a boyfriend, an older boyfriend. And it's very popular. It's all over South Korean music and movies. And North Koreans started to say it, right? And they do it in a way with aegyo, this cutesy voice that is explicitly forbade. Now, it's in the actual legislation. Do not say oppa. Don't say it. It's not allowed, right? So that shows you the extent to which that speech pattern was traveling through the country. So let's ask, how do North Koreans think and feel about the countries around them? How do they think and feel about the United States, right? Again, my mission in this talk is to figure out whether the Hungnam story could be an effective use of public diplomacy to get them to think differently about the United States. So let's see first how they think about us. So this question, the respondents were asked which country is the most threatening. So they could only pick one country that they thought was the most threatening towards North Korea. And they were asked, how did you feel when you were living in North Korea, right? And as you could see, the number one answer is the United States. And it's been going, there's a line of best fit there. That number has been rising slightly over time, but we're not moving in the positive direction, right? The surveys end in 2020 because after that, there's a pandemic era border closure, and refugees from from North Korea to South Korea have basically slowed to a standstill. It's impossible statistically to continue to do these surveys in a meaningful way. So things have changed since 2020. We just don't know how. We can conjecture. We do see some interesting patterns in the data, right? The perception of threat from the United States goes up and down, and there's a negative correlation between the threat perception from the United States and that from China. So another way to say that is when the threat perception from the US goes down, threat perception from China goes up, and vice versa. So that's kind of an interesting little observation, right? People that had more exposure to Korean culture, South Korean culture, tended to have less of a threat perception towards the United States, and people who had more education in North Korea tended to have less of a threat perception about the United States. All interesting things. So what countries do North Korean people feel closest to? So here we have an interesting trend line. Started out, a vast majority felt closest to China, but that number has gone down, down, down over time. And the number of those who feel close to South Korea has incrementally risen over time. Still China in the lead, but the trend is the friend. Those with relatives in the South tended to have an affinity for South Korea, and only a very tiny fraction picked the United States. Again, they could only pick one country in this survey. Which country is it necessary to cooperate with on unification? So South Korea is not included here because it's obvious that, that they're the number one country that you have to work with on unification. So what other regional country is important? So again, we see China's role relatively is still at the top, but going down incrementally. The U.S. role going up, people having increased expectations for the U.S. role. In 2019, you could see that was right around the time of Rapprochement, like the season of symmetry, and Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump were meeting, and there were a lot of high hopes. So that went up, and then the next year it went down a little bit. So North Korean people are responding and reacting to events in real time. And then over time, a large share of folks have said nobody. And that could be a reaction to North Korean media, which insists on the Juche ideology is one of self-reliance. So perhaps that's having an impact on folks, or they're just losing faith, right? After so many cycles of failed diplomacy and rapprochement attempts with their neighboring countries, maybe they're saying nothing seems to work. And then we ask the question, to prosper, to succeed economically, which country do you need to work closely with? And South Korea has the lead here, and China's share is decreasing while the US role is increasing. So another case of the trend being the friend, right? Some opportunities here, some perceptions that are already out there that could be supported with complementary narratives. So it was around the time of symmetry in 2018, 2019 that the hopes for the US role started to rise in terms of economic support. And again, those who consume Korean culture tended to perceive the US, Japan, and South Korea as necessary for North Korea's development. So those folks who are exposed to this media tend to have a more friendly face towards the US and Korea. So what are the key takeaways from this survey? America is seen as a threat by ordinary people, but as an important role player for Korea's future in terms of unification, in terms of economics, and that expectations fluctuate depending on conditions, and that those who have more exposure to media from the outside world tend to have a rosier perception of the United States. So why do I think that the Hungnam evacuation story is perfect? All these conditions, so I just kind of set the table here in order to bring it home. It's an inspirational true story. It shows Americans and Koreans, I think that's another important aspect that Josh talked about earlier, the Koreans helping Koreans side of things as well. And very importantly, putting humanitarian objectives over military objectives. That is something that flies directly in the face of what North Koreans are taught every day about the character, the national character of what an American is. When I think about the kind of American that I want North Koreans to imagine as generic and representative, I think about Burley Smith. He's the picture of what it means to be American that could be so powerful in helping to lead to a different understanding about what the future relationship of our countries could lead to. Again, Americans are presented as cruel, vindictive, bloodthirsty. I thought to show some propaganda posters, but they're really sickening. I didn't want to subject you to it. Soldiers bayoneting innocent women, just preposterous things, but designed to dehumanize. That's the point, to dehumanize. So the Hungnam evacuation story is uniquely compelling at rehumanizing, showing that there is a deep moral character to Americans in the way that we've interacted with Koreans over the years. It also is very effective at recasting South Korea, right? Because South Korea is presented in North Korean propaganda as a bunch of beggars and thieves, capitalism run amok, and they're all toadies and bootlickers of South Korea. But when you look at the tremendous success of the 1 million descendants of the Hungnam evacuation who are alive in South Korea today, it is undeniable that this country and this system that they've come to and helped to promote, I mean, it's a pretty sizable percentage of the population, right? 55 million people in South Korea, 1 million. So like 2% of the population of contemporary South Korea came from the Hungnam evacuation, a huge chunk of the population relatively, right? And they've contributed to the system and they've been the beneficiaries of this system. I think that's a lesson of look what happens, look how high you can fly when you're in a capitalist, free market democracy with civil liberties and human rights protected, as contrasted with North Korea. And then finally, the separated families tragedy, right? So the North Koreans tried to spin this on its head, say, thanks to the Hungnam evacuation, all these families have been separated. But really, South Korea has been eager, willing, and ready to have family reunions, video calls, phone calls, anytime, anywhere, any place. And it is the North Korean government that has politicized that and used it against the South Koreans in a game of bargaining and one-upsmanship in negotiations. So it is really the North Korean government that is standing in the way there. So that this story is another way to demonstrate that there is some healing that can occur whenever the North Korean government steps aside. So I don't want to oversell this, right? It's a public diplomacy initiative. It's aimed at the general public. It is a long-term vision, how perceptions can vary gradually and slowly change, but for the better. I'm not a collapsist. I'm not the kind of guy who thinks that North Korea is going to collapse tomorrow, right? We need to prepare for a long-term situation in which we could have a soft landing, right? A very gradual change of government or relations between the two Koreas in the U.S. and North Korea? And wouldn't this type of initiative that aims to, on as broad a base as possible, lead to more rapprochement, kinder feelings, kinship between the two Koreas, between the U.S. and North Korea, be the right direction to go? There's already a lot of positive content that promotes inter-Korean healing. So my argument here is, let's get in on the game. Let's promote some U.S. North Korean healing through an inspirational story. So I'll leave it there and cede to any questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.